thing. By the way, this is slide number 25 of last lecture, just to finish up. But first, let's think about, so hooray, we've made it through 2 weeks. That's 20% of the quarter. We only have to do this 4 more times, and we're done. I like the lab. You know, I dropped by both times, and you guys seem to be hearing things. And there was a nice mix of a few abnormal sounds, some murmurs, and I tried to offer my abnormal blood pressure whenever I could. So you guys heard both normal and abnormal things in the labs. That's good. So today's Friday. My office hour today starts at 11 till 12:30. I noticed that conflicts if you're going to Officer Corona's memorial, and I have no grudge either way. If you'd like to attend Officer Corona's memorial, it's at the pavilion starting at 11 o'clock. I would cry too much, so I'll be over here. You're welcome to come see me. Then next week, I didn't want to load you up about the discussion until you've actually finished your lab. So you do have a discussion next week. Remember, Monday won't meet because of Dr. King's Day, and I'll come back to talk about that in just a second. But when you come to discussion, whatever time you go, you want to have read in advance the American College of Sports Medicine chapters 2 and 3. This is the manual, the American College of Sports Medicine manual. I have this one here for loanage, and I have another one back, another 2 back at my office if you'd like to take a loaner over the weekend. Chapters 2 and 3 are 2 is the pre-participation health screening, and chapter 3 is called something. Pre-exercise evaluation. So pre-participation health screening is mostly interviewing and history taking. Pre-exercise evaluation has more to do with measurements like the measurements you made in the lab. Read those 2. Of course, read your lab manual, discussion 1. That's only about 2 pages. And then when you come to lab, bring the handout for discussion 1, the homework from your first lab. It's only about 6 questions, I think, pretty easy. And then discussion handout 1.1. Discussion handout 1.1 is a health history where you write down your own personal health history. And we will try to keep that private, away from the other students. It's just for us. Yes, ma'am?
Is the quiz going to be like a pre-discussion quiz, or is it going to be a post-lab quiz?
What a great question, Mesa. I'm pretty sure it's a pre-discussion quiz, like, what are we going to talk about today in discussion? But it's such a good question, and I have it too. I have to say, I have some discussion. Where's pre-lab quizzes? TAs? I don't know. Let me work on that. My belief is that the pre-quizzes are always about what is it I'm about to do to indicate that you've read these.
Oh, okay.
I'm pretty sure about that. But you've got to find it. Have I given you quizzes for? Okay. Fine. We'll find it. Martin Luther King Day. So, because we're not having class on Monday, how many people could attend discussion on Wednesday from 10, and you'll get out by about noon. It won't take more than 2 hours. So how many, that's actually not a good way to say it. How many people can't do that? How many people in Monday's section, their problem is not solved by that? Okay, that's not too bad. Okay, then those people who just raised their hands, how many of you could come on Friday, next Friday, between 11 and 12:30? So is anyone, let's see, whose problems are not solved by that solution? Crap. So you two should think about the TAs just posted their office hours, and they would get special, Kelly, and say your name again? Ping should get special attention to sort of get a private discussion, because I can't do anything more than those 2 things. All right, good enough. Yay. Just generally speaking, the discussions, just because you guys continue to be confused because of what the register does, the discussions always start at the same time as the labs, they just get out earlier. So the discussion is rarely, 90 minutes to 2 hours at the longest. Yes?
Is there an option to reschedule your office hours on Monday?
Oh, you'd like to replace that? Yeah, I could look into that, like something on Wednesday instead.
Or before the quiz? Or 2 o'clock?
Oh, gosh, Wednesday at 8 o'clock, something like that. It's ambitious. I mean, I'm not against it. I'll always turn out.
Or is there a Tuesday option?
Oh, Tuesday, what fun. Like Tuesday in the afternoon, maybe? Tuesday at 4 o'clock?
Yeah.
Something like that? Okay, I will work on that, post it. Thank you. Okay, so we better get going. We're spending so much time talking about the future, we'll never get to the now. 4 o'clock, office hour, question mark, announce. Good. It's okay? Okay. So the lectures, so we're going to pick up you'll notice the lectures have been I don't finish a lecture in the time allotted, and that'll stop because I'm about to be done with Dr. Harris's lectures, who had 60 lectures, and I've cut them down to 30 and 35. Well, pretty soon we're going to start my lectures, and we'll finish each lecture. So we're starting here on slide 25 of the last lecture. In the middle of those slides that I said the answer is always calcium in the heart. And so this is reviewing for excitation. Excitation starts when an action potential opens these L-type calcium channels. And so instead of the dihydropyridine receptor that we have in skeletal muscle that's voltage sensitive, we have an L-type calcium channel that's voltage sensitive. And it opens up and lets calcium flow in. The ryanodine receptor in cardiac muscle is specifically sensitive to this so-called triggering calcium. And in the presence of it, it releases its own calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and that's what gives us a contraction. I have, I think, 4 more calcium slides to point out how critical. Notice every circle here has to do with calcium. Calcium, calcium, calcium. Contraction. So this is showing you just how powerfully the amount of tension is modulated. So this is the amount of force. And this is in an isometric contraction. So this is an animal model where you fix the muscle at a set distance. So you can't have the optimizing effects of stretch here. All we're talking about here is calcium at one level of stretch. And so notice that this is the, what do we call it, pH. This is the P calcium, the negative log and calcium ion. Don't worry about it. The smaller the number gets, the more calcium ions there are. So notice that it's not a small effect. That you go from, what would that be, about 5.4 to maybe 5.2, and the force more than doubles. So the presence, we presume what this means is with more calcium presence is binding to more of the calcium troponin and pulling the tropomyosin more widely off of the binding site. So basically there's more total binding sites upon which to work. And the turnover will be faster of the binding sites. So watch what happens when you combine this. There's a thing called, let's see if we can find the words for it, the calcium sensitivity of tension. So tension is responsive to calcium. What's interesting is when you put more stretch on the sarcomere, that amplifies the effect. Now, I don't know if that's simply because of you're offering more binding sites or whether there's more subtle things happening. I rather expect it's both. But notice here what we have is sarcomere length is going up at any given level of calcium. So just arbitrarily take 10 as our level. And if the sarcomere has been stretched 65% beyond its resting length, you get that much force. But if you stretch it to 2 times the resting length, so 40% more stretch, you're getting 5 times as much force. So very small additional increments in stretch create rather large increments in force. And so what this is saying is that effect, the calcium potentiates or amplifies the basic Frank-Starling effect. Yes, sir?
Is there a limit where this, you stop getting a positive?
Oh, saturation. Yeah, there should be, and I don't know where that is. That would be the topic, especially for sarcomere stretch. As you go much beyond 2.5, the sarcomere becomes so stretched, the actins can't grab, the myosin can't get a hold of the actin, and that's congestive failure. When we talk about congestive failure, that's the equivalent of going off the end of this curve.
So is the increased sarcomere then a consequence of increased calcium, or is it?
Other way around. This is just adding more stretch in the lab than throwing in the calcium to see what happens, and you get much more force as the sarcomere is extended in ranges from 1 to say 2.5 times sarcomere resting. All of this, what this is all hinting at, remember I said hearts like stretch? It's pretty much all I've said. Now I'm saying hearts like stretch and calcium. All right, so the last part of this lecture, we can get into the next lecture, is the concept of relaxation. So once you got the contraction happening, because there's calcium all over your troponin C and pulling the tropomyosin to expose the binding sites, how do you stop the contraction? You must remove the intracellular calcium. Sequester is the word I like, of course, means to hide away. And sequester juries when they're supposed to decide on their own. And so I think you're aware that there is a sarcoendoplasmic reticular calcium pump that is an ATPase pump. And that's how we put away, so we often say the circuit pump is what removes the intracellular calcium and terminates the contraction. Guys remember that vaguely? Same in cardiac muscle. When you start to think about how does relaxation occur, about 20% of the total calcium goes outside the cell. It becomes triggering calcium waiting to be triggered again. So this, what do you call those, antiporter? This sodium calcium antiporter and an ATPase calcium transporter in the membrane of the myocyte moves about 20%, but 80% of the calcium load that causes it, that must be hidden before it's by the circuit pump. Circuit pumps are pretty important. Now, has anyone talked to you about phospholamban? You've never heard that, have you? Good. Okay. It's okay. The way, notice that phospholamban is indicated here, and notice how it's almost like a cap or a brake. What this is trying to indicate is phospholamban is the regulatory protein that determines how fast the ATP pump in the sarcoplasmic reticular membrane is allowed to go. And in its natural state at rest, phospholamban inhibits. It's like a governor. Are you guys aware that a golf cart can go like 50 miles an hour? And because the resorts don't want you going 50 miles an hour on the course, they put what's called a governor on the engine that keeps the speed down below 20 miles an hour. You with me? That's phospholamban. It's an inhibitory governor that slows things down at rest. Well, remember we talked about how I said way back at the beginning of this lecture, if we speed up the rates of contraction, we must also speed up the rates of relaxation, or we're going to get behind. And so one of the things we'll see is disinhibiting phospholamban, getting this thing to come off the circuit pump, is what lets the circuit pump run faster, for instance, in conditions of exercise. So that brings me to the last point of this lecture, and I think it's only like 3 slides. It's the beta-adrenergic stimulations. Remember, there'd be a membrane here, epinephrine or norepinephrine would be coming in here, G protein coupled activities, and ultimately you get to protein kinase A. Remember, a kinase is something that phosphorylates other things. That's what a kinase is. It's an enzyme that phosphorylates. Protein kinase wanders around the cell and with high specificity phosphorylates certain proteins. And and alters their function. And so what I'm about to show you is that the adrenergic stimulation, I think you were aware that the reason the heart rate here speeds up from 1 every second to 3 every second has to do with catecholamine stimulation of the pacemaker, right? We'll talk about that next time. But what I want to point out is, have you noticed the rates of relaxation here? Here's the initial rate of relaxation at rest. Relaxation is proceeding much faster in the stimulated state. So not only is this steeper, this is steeper. Oh, by the way, I was talking to someone and walking over, I think it was Jasper, about how the diastolic pressure during exercise tends to stay very close to the diastolic pressure at rest. It's primarily the systolic pressure that goes up. It is. Because force of heart contraction is what's going up. Arteriolar dilation, if anything, actually drops with time slightly. Whoever asked that question, there's the answer. All right, so diastole must also proceed more quickly during exercise. The diastolic functions are often referred to as lusitropy. And the things that have to happen are, you must put away all the calcium, you must relax as a physical muscle to accept the next filling load. Remember, we saw that coronary flow happen. So if you can't relax, you can't get blood flow to the muscle, and that's bad news. Makes sense? That's lusitropy. And so I'm going to show you several of the things that protein kinase A phosphorylates. Oh, look, that one's going. Go, Jim Daddy. So protein kinase will phosphorylate the L-type calcium channels. So that means once you start contractions, you'll actually get faster depolarization under the influence of sympathetic stimulation. That would account for faster heart rates, for example. Phospholambda becomes phosphorylated, and that phosphorylation removes the inhibition. So now the circuit pump, so if you're spilling the calcium faster, you can also put it away faster. That make sense? We'll talk a little bit about the inhibitory troponin and the myoglobin binding protein C, but let me go to the next slide, it'll be easier. So protein kinase A, as a result of adrenergic stimulation, epinephrine, does two things that speed up depolarization and contraction. Phosphorylation by protein kinase of the calcium channels increases the rate of calcium influx and the total peak, so you get more powerful contraction. Phosphorylation of myosin binding protein C actually increases the amount of force you get with each contraction. Very subtle stuff. I'm probably not going to ask you a lot about these things on exams. Then notice, I just said, if contraction is more giddy up and more powerful, you also have to put away the calcium more rapidly and completely. And so notice that phospholambda being phosphorylated allows you to put away calcium more rapidly. And then I really like this one. This is cool. Remember the inhibitory troponin on there's troponin I, T, and calcium C. Troponin I is the one that, in the absence of calcium, then yanks the tropomyosin to cover the binding sites. Well, when troponin inhibitory is phosphorylated by protein kinase, it actually does that job faster. And so the heart actually relaxes faster. Is that okay? So what we're talking about for the next lecture, which I'll start right now, has to do with heart rate and conduction. So we've talked a lot about the determinants of the stroke volume. Now we're going to talk about how we control heartbeats. Any questions about that much? That seem okay? Yes, Ignacio?
Will the strength and contraction increase for anything besides stroke volume increase?
The rate of contraction?
So we're talking mostly about the rate of contraction,
Sure.
not the strength and contraction.
Oh, well, certainly, yes. All the things that increase what's called inotropy will increase strength and contraction as well. Yeah. They almost always go together in a natural system. So now we're going to talk about, I mentioned that because there's not nerve stimulation that the brain controls, let's light up the atrium. Okay, now let's light up the septum. Okay, now all of that has to be intrinsic to the heart structure itself. There are no nerves. There is no controlling brain function other than the ring of sinoatrial depolarization. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the conduction pathways, talk a little bit about the action potentials. I doubt we'll get to arrhythmias today, but we'll start. So we talked already a lot about this. This is the same slide I ended with. Now we're going to talk about the electrical properties of the myocardium. This is a sinoatrial pacemaker cell reaching depolarization at 40. That's real kind of type of polar. 30, 40, there we go. And then, so remember that, so instead of having nerves, what we have in the heart is several specialized populations of cells that have slightly different electrophysiologic properties. Pacemakers tend to depolarize quickly, spontaneously, but they do not conduct electricity fast. They release electricity, then go back to sleep until the next beat. The specialized conducting pathways often have enhanced rates of spreading because they want to get the electrical impulse everywhere at once, so you have a nice coordinated contraction. So we'll look at that right now. Oh, absent motor units and nerves, this coordination must be intrinsic to the way the heart is built. All right. So this should be review, but we'll go into more detail just as we have been. So the sinoatrial pacemaker in the right atrium is the usual pacemaker. It's the native or natural pacemaker for most situations. It releases its electrical impulse into the right atrial myocyte population, and there are some specialized conducting pathways in the atrium, but let's not talk about them. Until you're a cardiologist, you don't need to know about the bundle of Kent. So for the most part, you can think about atrial depolarization as just spreading like a ripple in pond water of electricity from one cell to the next. And that's pretty darn fair for, again, until you're an electrocardiologist. So as it moves across, so that means it moves down and to the left because it originated high on the right. Eventually, the impulse, the last of the atrial myocytes that go off are juxta the atrioventricular sulcus, and there they pass electricity to the atrioventricular node. From there, it's interesting, the atrioventricular node holds, it's almost like a maze. It's like that maze in Harry Potter #4, where it almost, the electrical impulse just wanders around in there. And that's not bad. What it's doing is wasting time so that the atria can actually contract and shove blood into the ventricle. Time for electromechanical coupling of the atria. Then, as soon as the ventricles have had their final kick of blood from the atria, then the electricity is released into the His bundle and the two bundle branches. Right and left. Does that sound vaguely familiar? Okay, let's learn more about it. Let's look at the area from below, from the atrioventricular sulcus down. Here is a model of the AV node, the His bundle, the left bundle branch, and the right bundle branch. You'll see in a moment that the bundle branches deliver the electricity to a very specific place, which I think is on the next slide. This also shows you that the left bundle is redundant. It's thicker, so it's big, it's harder to block. In other words, harder to die. And it has two fascicles. So left bundle branch block is harder to induce. You actually have to kill cardiac tissue to do it. The right bundle is thin and rickety and is often blocked for physiologic, for non-pathological reasons. So we'll talk about that as we go on. Where is that? Oh, let me go back. Notice here, I've gone back one slide. Notice that these fascicles of the left bundle, they seem to terminate in the papillary muscle. Let's follow the right. Oh, it seems to terminate. Why would it be good to have the very first part of the ventricle to tense be the papillary muscles? We want to do the reverse experiment. Start the contraction before the valves are stabilized. It blows the atrioventricular valves back up into the atria, and you get backwash. And so the idea here is electricity first comes to the papillary muscles. The papillary muscles go, hatches are secure, begin contractions. They're holding down the AV valve, and then you can profitably begin contraction, because if these are locked shut, then only that will open. Does that make sense? Good. When we look at then at the sequence of event, remember, if I originate, you get the feeling the heart will always do it right. No, if I originate a electrical pulse right there, the heart will operate perfectly backwards. There is nothing in the heart that determines directionality except who's first. So, or if I delivered an electrical, I had a PAC, an early contraction right here, I could run the top part of the heart from left to right. So there is no intrinsic direction within the cells except that which is just by timing. So if, as it ought to be, the sinoatrial node goes first, you go downward and to the left. The AV node holds the contraction long enough for these to contract. See, no one knows how to make a figure. These should be smaller now because they're contracting. The electrical impulse is then released. Because of the His bundle and the two bundle branches, it is the septum that first stabilizes, and it tends to go from left to right, downward. You'll see this becomes important later on, but for now, just track it. So you stabilize the septum first, including the valve leaflets. Then, once you've got that stabilized, you begin to light up the sidewalls, and these two move in and up relative to the atrioventricular. Does that make sense? Okay, that's the sequence. Now, as I just said, it doesn't have to be that way. What keeps it that way? Notice that these are how fast things conduct. Leave off for the idea, the sinoatrial node and the AV node, they're not about conduction, they're about generating electricity. So they do not pass electricity quick. Notice, oh, look at the Purkinje system. Right? So the Purkinje system is all about getting the electrical impulse quickly to the whole of the myocardium. Are any of you able to do this trick in the pool where you take your hands and suck up water and squirt it? That is so much what a ventricle does, you can't believe it. And I'm completely incapable of it, so I just bring up water and it just kind of goes in my face. But it's because I am not, as you guys apparently can who can do this. You must have the contraction start at the back of the hand and move forward and have the least resistance to flow, not being between your fingers so you get in the face, but at the base of the palm so it shoots out, right? You probably never thought about it, now you won't be able to do it. That is what's happening in a contraction, and so having the impulse kind of, you stabilize the center and then have the impulse sort of start from the bottom and push upward is the optimal sequence. So the bundle, the Purkinje system rapidly transmits the electricity to the parts of the heart. Another critical thing is you do not want the ventricles to contract until the atria have contracted. Can everyone go with that? So it is best, this is why the AV node is the gatekeeper and it's so slow. There is also a cartilaginous ring that holds the valves. And besides holding the valves, it's electrically non-conductive. It's sometimes called the os, the bone, los huesos en español, the os of the heart, el hueso del corazón. So it is meant to stop electricity. Besides stabilizing the valves, it also stops the electricity. Your AV node would be like right there. Now this is instead of conductivity, this is actually the rate. How quickly do they generate their own spontaneous depolarizations, pacemaker function? So notice, the sinoatrial node, even with parasympathetic tone on it, is usually above 60. right? If you take all the parasympathetic tone, it'll run around 100. Notice that the AV node is slower than that. AV node kind of starts where the sinoatrial node leaves off. And rarely will your AV node be allowed to speak out simply because the sinoatrial node talks faster. But what do you suppose will happen if the sinoatrial node for some reason is sick or delayed or poisoned? Then the AV node takes over. That's perfectly adequate for supporting resting life. Probably even walk upstairs. You could go down to a Purkinje pacemaker, and that would probably keep you conscious. You'd feel weird if you went up 2 flights of stairs. And then you can actually, the cardiac myocytes, I'll show you a picture later on of cardiac myocyte going on its own speed. And these usually won't support consciousness, but they might support your brain. You know, your family members find you on the floor with a heart rate of 20, you'll be unconscious, but if you get the person to the hospital and get their perfusion up, they may survive that. So one way to think about these stacked pacemakers is these are backups. These are backups for illness or damage. Yeah?
If the AV node is in charge of compression, does the atrium contract as well? Does it go up?
We'll talk about that. Thank you. That's really cool. If the AV node had taken over contraction, it would tend to fire off the ventricle and release the impulse into the atria at basically the same time. And so the atria would contract, but they would tend to be contracting against a closed AV valve, in which case you would tend to get a venous flutter wave going backwards the wrong direction. So that would be one way you could visibly inspect someone and suspect they were using their AV node instead of their sinus. Yes?
How do pacemaker cells automark?
That's the next question. Everyone here, so Mary says, so how are pacemaker cells doing that? And that's where we're going to go on the next slide. Let's see, before I leave, oh, this is fun. So just 2 definitional words, because we're going to start talking about abnormal beats. An escape beat is when the higher pacemaker, for reasons we don't understand, is shut up, and the next pacemaker escapes from its normal submission. It's allowed to speak out. The lieutenant is allowed to speak out because the major is just shut up. So that's an escape beat. An ectopic beat is when a beat originates from outside the normal pacemaking system. So I showed some examples where the left atrium, for some reason, a bunch of myocytes in there took over, or at the base of the ventricle, there's a population in there that's irritable, overstimulated by the cocaine you just took, and now they start going off for no reason. So it's ectopic beat. Oh, remember we have ectopic pregnancies when the egg implants outside of the uterus. So ectopic just means outside the normal place. So an ectopic beat is beat originating from outside a normal pacemaker. Escape beat is when a lower, slower pacemaker is allowed to speak, usually because the higher, faster pacemaker has gotten killed. All okay? So Mary's question is absolutely perfect. How do we, not only how do we get spontaneous depolarizations, but how do we then modulate their rate? That's where the rest of this lecture goes. So notice that pacemaker cells don't have this long shoulder like the muscle cells. Again, I suspect this long shoulder of depolarization has to do with keeping the contraction going for something well over 100 milliseconds. Right? With a nerve, it's just a pure spike. Here, we actually need the contraction to continue from the back of the hand to the front of the hand, so it has to go for quite a while. Then, this is showing you, in a general way, in a cardiac muscle, where does the depolarization come from? And so if this is the sum total up here for a ventricular cell, it's really just a spin on what nerves do. I think you're familiar with a rapid sodium influx. Yes? And an outward flow of potassium for an action potential. So what the cardiac cell has done is it takes these 2 basic things and somehow it wants to extend the depolarization. So in extending the main thing that's doing is extending the inward flow of calcium. Right? Also, it extends the outward flow of potassium. Remember, this is a divalent cation. This is a monovalent cation. So if these are cross-flowing, you're still depolarizing to the tune of 1 electron per switch, 1 proton per switch. Am I making sense? And so it makes this big shoulder, and then finally repolarization occurs at the end. So you could drive yourself crazy, and many of you electric. Dr. Goldman was here. The class would now stall for 3 weeks while we discuss this, but I'm going to keep going because I'm a simpler guy. So remember how many different, these are cardiac myocytes. Here's those gap junctions by which they share electricity. We've already talked about a sodium-calcium transport antiporter. We've talked about a calcium ATPase in the surface. We've talked about a calcium sequesterer that is inhibited by phospholamban. We talked about, where's L-type calcium? That's probably an L-type calcium channel. Does everyone see we could solve the Nernst equation? Does anyone want to? Good. So let's go on to something a little more practical. Here is a Purkinje cell depolarization. Notice the total depolarization is amazingly long. If the nerve is done in 5 milliseconds, to be out here at 220 milliseconds is huge. So sustained contraction. How is it doing that? It uses the same basic influx that a nerve cell would. Notice there's a little ongoing thing. The biggest thing that's holding this up is that calcium downward, to help understand this, hang on, we'll keep it simple. A downward reflection, a downward flow here is a cation flowing in, so it's depolarizing. If you have something above the line down here, upward deflections are the outflow of a positive ion, which would be repolarization. So I tried to simplify this. So the main thing that's happening for dipole, sudden influx of sodium, long sustained influx of calcium creates this high shoulder thing. I am getting to Mary's question. Do you see how complicated we could make it? Let's not. For instance, I will say a couple of things about repolarization. Repolarization will be about, looks like there's some, the potassium flowing outward starts to become predominant towards the end. Notice also, there was something else I wanted to show you. Most of it is yeah, that's right. Most of it is potassium dominating as calcium shuts off. Potassium outflux tends to create repolarization. Now to Mary's question, one of these, see this one here? Current, I is current, sub F. Does anyone know what sub F stands for? The funny current, literally is named the funny current. It's a funny little current that happens not in result of stimulation, but constantly. As soon as the cell repolarizes, this is a slow accumulating leak of inward cation flow that ultimately will bring the cell to spontaneous depolarization. So Mary, the I funny is often called the pacemaker current. And here in another figure, this thing here, that we used to call it the phase 4 spontaneous depolarization. But this current down here, notice if you follow it along, it keeps trickling until it actually gets to the threshold potential. And then the other channels open and create this sudden influx. Yeah.
So the funny current only happens if there are original action potentials.
Well, funny currents are spontaneous. And so if you actually isolate a cytoatrial node, Dr. Goldberg in our department used to do this. You take out a cytoatrial node, cut off all the nerves from it, put it in a petri dish, and give it the oxygen and glucose it wants. You're going to sit there and depolarize at 100 per minute indefinitely. Because the rate at which the rate of this slope is 100 per minute in the absence of neurostimulation. So pacemaker cells just go around. Now muscle cells, if you cut them out and put them in a dish, Where's my nerve? They will never, unless you do something hard and mean to them, they won't be polarized on their own. And that's kind of what distinguishes pacemaker cells, is the presence of this funny current. It also tells you among the different pacemakers who has the steepest or fastest funny current. The sinoatrial node, right, has to beat out the other ones. So, here's a pacemaker cell, anticipating exactly what I said. Notice they don't care about having the long shoulder. What is unique about them is their funny current, and particularly the steepness of the funny current at total volume, meaning that it reaches its triggering potential. And you can actually figure out, I wonder if I can figure out the heart rate here. So triggers there, it's about 350 milliseconds, and then 2/3 of the time will be spent diastole. The heart rate here is 60. And it's directly due to the funny current. Oh, sorry, it says here, I didn't include the time at diastole. Okay. If you don't, I interpret, if this as it actually sits, the distance from here to here, that's beat to beat, is more like 171, which tells you it's a mouse. It's not a human. Yeah.
So since all like the AV nodes and the Purkinje fibers and everything, they have
Yes, autorhythmicity,
So
absolutely.
how are they under control of the SA nerve?
Well, because if the slope for a Purkinje cell is like this, the Purkinje cell is not going to go off until over here. Well, as soon as this goes off, its action potential will propagate cell to cell. And so the Purkinje cell never reaches its own spontaneous depolarization. It tends to be driven by, it's sort of like having a work crew where only the work crew boss has initiative, and the actual workers are sort of sitting there with their shovels going, And so if the boss comes and goes, hey, dig, yeah, right. But they're very slow to begin digging on their own. They are driven from above. So, this gets to the last part. Maybe this lecture will get done. That'd be very good. So, the final part, which I thought is what you were about to go to, Quincy. So, if the folks with the slower phase 4 depolarization, slower funny current, they don't ever get to make their own action potentials. They're always told by someone above, make an action potential. Here's my electricity. Then finally, we would like to be able to control the rate at which the native pacemaker, the sinoatrial node, functions, because we want a heart rate of 60 at rest, and we want a heart rate of 180 when we're working hard. So how do we do that? Well, we do that by, in fact, this shows you several ways you can do it. You can change the threshold potential. If you drop the threshold potential, you can get a faster heart rate. You can change the slope of the funny current. That would do it. Or you could hyperpolarize the cell. Those are three different mechanisms by which you can slow or speed a heart. And by far, the most common one that we use, this is showing you the same thing, that you can change the threshold potential. You could change the maximum hyperpolarization, and you can change the slope of the phase 4. I have to say the thing that is done routinely is to change the rate of the phase 4 depolarization. Occasionally there's some small changes in hyperpolarization. I've never seen data about changing the threshold. The threshold potential tends to stay fixed at 40 millivolts. So, good, we are going to finish this lecture. So, when you're talking about this is an AV nodal cell, it would be the same for a sinoatrial cell. If the dotted line is the native speed, notice that sympathetic stimulation, remember we said it actually binds to sympathetic protein kinase A will bind to the L-type calcium channels and make a faster influx. Well, that will include influencing the phase 4, which is the phase 4 depolarization is a mixed cation channel, and it does respond to catecholamines. So what you'll see is when you get sympathetic stimulation, this slope goes up, and you reach threshold faster heart. This would be parasympathetic tone, acetylcholine dropped on the heart. You guys ever do frog experiments anymore in BIS? Do they still let you drop atropine or acetylcholine onto the heart? It's very impressive. You remember it. If you drop acetylcholine on a pacemaker, it slows way down. So, and what's happening, of course, is the native funny current is dropping to here, and so the time to reach the... Notice in this example, the threshold potential is not changing, and the maximum depolarization is changing by not too much. So those are the two things that mostly change. Notice with the sympathetic, the maximal depolarization is changing by almost nothing. So you could sort of, if you want to simplify, think of it as changing the slope of the funny current is the most powerful way the heart will change. Does that all make sense? Okay. I think I only have one slide. I don't like the last slide, so I may ignore it. So if we're talking about changing the action potential properties inside a cell, we've just talked about how the action potential duration in a resting cell is about in that range. And then if you have 2/3 more time in a human, this is the total action potential time, and then you tend to have at least the same or more amount of time for diastole. That'll make your heart rate around 60 to 70. So when you speed it up, we've already said, if you shorten the action potential, if you speed up the heart rate and speed up the action potential duration, you also have to speed up the rate of relaxation and shorten the diastolic interval. And almost all of these things will happen automatically with sympathetic stimulation. You can go back to that slide where I showed you the things that protein kinase is doing both speed up the rate of depolarization, the force of contraction, and they speed up the rate of relaxation at the end. No? Go ahead. That's as far as I go. This last slide makes a point that here, let's see what other points are here. Yeah, so for this one, I think I directly calculated. This is a heart rate of about 75 beats per minute. Notice that at least, it's usually 1/3 and 2/3 at rest. 1/3 of the time in systole, 2/3 of the time in diastole. Then notice that during exercise, if you take this one and just take it as it stands, this is about 180 beats per minute. The duration of the action potential has been cut in half. And you can actually see that in the graph. The action potential is now done in half the time. And you've also removed the vast majority of the diastole. So when you calculate this out, it becomes 180 beats per minute. Is that okay? This last one makes a point that I don't think you need to know about. Just forget the last slide, and I'll never ask you about it. We agreed? Wow, right on time. Have an awesome 3-day weekend.
Dr. Shafrath, this isn't on our quiz, right? Or is
Today is not on our quiz. Mesa noticed that it's a rather different topic than what we talked about before. No, only the basics of cardiovascular physiology are on the quiz. This is a transitional lecture that won't be on the quiz. Good. Thank you. All right, I'll be available for talk gauge at 11 o'clock in my office. So it's got to be something that alters the rate of propagation of the action potential. Did you in any of your BIS classes learn about the giant squid axon? Yes. Where one of the things that makes for fast, one of the reasons why fast